Have you ever held something ordinary, a warm cup in your hands, a simple drink, a daily habit, a quiet comfort, and never asked what it built? Because once, a leaf helped shape the most powerful empire on earth. Not a sword, not a crown, not a battlefield. Tea. It sat in porcelain cups, in silent kitchens, on rainy mornings, on royal tables. It looked harmless, soft, civilized, comforting. But behind that comfort was hunger, trade, addiction, war, and empire. Because tea did not just quench thirst, it moved ships, it changed economies, it redrew maps, it reached into homes and out into oceans. And for a time, it helped Britain rule the world. That is the strange part. One leaf, one habit, one empire. How does that happen? How does something so gentle become something so powerful? To understand that, we have to go back, far before London, far before the British Empire, far before tea became normal, back to a story almost wrapped in myth, ancient China, a world of forests, healers, emperors, and smoke rising from boiling water. Legend says that around 2737 BCE, a Chinese emperor named Shen Nong was sitting beneath a tree while water boiled nearby. Then, a few leaves drifted into the pot. An accident. A small one, easy to ignore. But when he tasted it, something changed. The water was no longer just water. It had bitterness, warmth, a strange life. Tea. Maybe that story is true, maybe it is not. But what matters is this. Tea was first not a luxury, not fashion, not empire. It was medicine, a plant with purpose, a drink for clarity, for digestion, for ritual, for calm. For centuries, tea lived quietly, inside monasteries, inside medicine, inside tradition. It was not yet a global obsession. It was a local secret, a leaf known deeply before it was known widely. And then slowly it spread, through dynasties, through merchants, through scholars and monks. Tea became more than a drink. It became culture, a ceremony, a language of patience, a symbol of discipline, of hospitality, of attention. In China, tea was refined. In Japan, it became ritual. In Asia, it was not just consumed, it was respected. It taught slowness, stillness, balance, a pause in human noise. But far away, in Europe, another kind of hunger was growing. A hunger not for stillness, but for more. More goods, more trade, more power, more control. Europe in the 1600s was changing fast. Ships were crossing oceans. Empires were reaching outward. Spices, silk, porcelain, sugar, everything exotic became valuable. Everything distant became desirable. And then tea arrived. At first, it was rare, expensive, a curiosity from the East, something only the wealthy could afford, a fashionable sip, a status symbol, a whisper of luxury in a fragile cup. And Britain fell in love. Not all at once, but enough. Enough for the leaf to begin its slow conquest. At first, tea was mostly for the elite, aristocrats, merchants, women in drawing rooms, men in political circles. It was served with elegance, with silver, with ceremony, and with gossip. But here's what made tea different. It fit perfectly into British life. It was warm in cold weather, stimulating but not wild, social but respectable. It was gentler than alcohol, cleaner than much of the water people drank. It felt civilized. It felt proper. And that made it dangerous. Because once a society starts believing that a product is not just enjoyable, but necessary, it becomes something else. Not a luxury, a need. And then everything shifted. Tea escaped the palaces. It entered the middle class, then the working class, then nearly everyone. Britain did not just like tea, Britain built itself around it. The tea table, the teapot, the teacup, the afternoon routine, the morning routine. Tea became comfort in a hard industrial world. And that matters, because the Britain of the 1700s and 1800s was not soft. It was noisy, dirty, crowded. Factories roared, cities swelled, children worked, air blackened, lives shortened. People were exhausted. And in the middle of that machinery, tea offered relief, a pause, a small warmth, a daily rhythm, a little order in a brutal age. That's why it spread so deeply. Tea was not just sold, it was emotionally adopted. It entered the body, then the home, then the culture, then the empire. Because once millions of people want something every day, you don't just trade it, you organize the world around it. And Britain did exactly that. By the 18th century, tea imports were exploding. What had once been rare became massive. Ship after ship crossed oceans carrying dried leaves from Asia to British ports. The demand was enormous, and demand like that changes nations. Tea was no longer a side product, it was economic fuel. Taxes on tea raised huge amounts of money. Trade around tea became one of the great engines of British wealth. Ports expanded, merchants grew rich, governments paid attention, and the British East India Company saw opportunity. That company was not just a business, it was a machine, a private empire with ships, soldiers, money, and political power. It traded like a company, but acted like a kingdom, and tea became one of its greatest prizes. At first, Britain depended heavily on China for tea, and this created a problem because China did not want much from Britain in return. Britain wanted tea, China wanted silver, and that meant silver was flowing out of Britain in huge amounts. That made British leaders nervous because empire doesn't like dependence. Empire doesn't like imbalance. Empire wants control, and control was slipping. So Britain looked for a solution, not a moral one, a profitable one. And here's where the story darkens, because tea did not rise alone. It rose with sugar, and sugar came soaked in slavery. For British tea to become sweet, someone else had to suffer. Plantations in the Caribbean worked by enslaved Africans produced the sugar that transformed tea from bitter leaf to addictive comfort. Think about that. A warm cup in London was connected to chains across the Atlantic. This is the part history often softens. The cup looked clean, but the system behind it was not. Tea was sold as refinement, as civilization, as domestic peace. But behind that peace was plantations, forced labor, extraction, profit built on pain. This is how empire often works. It hides violence behind routine. It wraps power in normal things. A drink, a spoonful, a habit. And people stop seeing the machine. But the machine was there, always there, and it kept growing. Then came another crisis. Britain still needed more tea, still needed control, still wanted to stop losing silver to China. So it turned to opium. Yes, opium, a drug, produced in British-controlled India, smuggled into China. Not by accident, not by chaos, by system. Britain sold opium to China to reverse the trade imbalance caused by tea. Read that again in your mind. A nation wanted tea so badly that it helped flood another nation with addiction. Tea on one side, opium on the other. That was the trade. That was the exchange. And when Chinese authorities tried to stop it, conflict exploded. The Opium Wars began. War, because of trade, because of demand, because one empire refused to lose access to what it wanted. That's the twist. Tea, the symbol of calm, was tied to one of the most morally disturbing trade systems in modern history. This is not just a story about taste, it's a story about appetite. And appetite without limits becomes conquest. China was forced open, ports were seized, treaties were imposed, power shifted, and Britain strengthened its global reach, all while millions back home simply kept boiling kettles. That's what makes empire so unsettling. Most people inside it don't feel like conquerors. They feel ordinary. They feel normal. They feel innocent. They're just drinking tea. But systems aren't innocent just because rituals are familiar. And Britain was not finished. Because depending on China still felt dangerous. So Britain made another move. It decided not just to buy tea, but to grow it under its own control. That decision changed landscapes forever. The British turned to India, a land they were already dominating through trade, force, and political manipulation. And there, in places like Assam and Darjeeling, tea would be transformed into an imperial crop. There's another strange irony here. Tea had existed in parts of India before. Wild tea plants grew there. But under British rule, tea was industrialized, systematized, weaponized economically. Forests were cleared, hills were carved into plantations, local systems were disrupted, and labor was needed, huge amounts of labor. Workers, often poor and desperate, were recruited, pressured, or trapped into plantation life under harsh conditions. Long hours, low pay, isolation, disease, control. Tea plantations looked beautiful from far away. Green rows, rolling ales, mist in the morning, almost poetic. But beauty has often been used to hide suffering, and tea plantations were no exception. The empire did not just want tea. It wanted cheap tea, reliable tea, scalable tea. And to get that, it needed control over land and people. So Britain built an empire of leaves, measured, packaged, shipped, sold. And soon, tea from India and later Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, began pouring into British markets. Now Britain no longer just consumed tea. It owned the pipeline, the soil, the labor, the roots, the profit. This was not taste, this was strategy. Tea became one of the perfect imperial commodities. Portable, profitable, habit-forming, socially accepted, easy to market, easy to normalize, easy to romanticize. And once tea became cheap enough, it became truly universal in Britain. Rich or poor, city or village, morning or afternoon, tea was there. In homes, in factories, in train stations, in army camps, in offices, in grief, in celebration. Tea became more than a product. It became national identity, a way of being British, a script for daily life, a ritual repeated across classes. That is powerful, because when a product enters identity, it stops being questioned. It becomes tradition. And tradition can be one of the strongest forms of control. Even war could not break it. During both world wars, tea remained essential to British morale. Governments understood something very important. Tea was not just a drink, it was emotional infrastructure. A cup of tea could calm fear, create familiarity, restore routine, make people feel human in inhuman times. Bombs fell, families grieved, cities burned, and still, the kettle boiled. There is something deeply moving about that, and also something deeply revealing, because tea had become woven into the British emotional nervous system. a comfort so strong it could survive history itself. But comfort always has a cost, and usually someone far away pays it first. That is the moral shadow of empire. The center feels peace, the edges feel pressure, the consumer feels warmth, the producer feels burden. And history repeats this pattern again and again. Tea was not the only thing that built the British Empire. Of course not. There were ships, armies, coal, industry, finance, violence, law, technology. But tea mattered more than many people realize. Because empires are not built only by generals. They are built by habits, by cravings, by daily routines so ordinary they disappear. A person wakes up, boils water, adds leaves, adds sugar, takes a sip. And somewhere beyond that moment, a whole system hums. That is how power survives. Not only in parliaments, not only in palaces, but in kitchens, in cupboards, in things people stop noticing. That is why tea is such a powerful story, because it reveals something uncomfortable about human civilization. We often imagine history as grand and obvious: kings, wars, flags, treaties. But often, history enters through the small door: a spoon, a cup, a leaf, something tiny, something domestic, something almost invisible. And once it enters, it can reshape the world. Even now, tea remains one of the most consumed drinks on earth. Billions of cups are poured every single day, across continents, across classes, across generations. It still carries comfort, still carries ritual, still carries memory. For many people, tea means family, rest, home, care. And none of that is false. That is important. The point is not to turn tea into a villain. The point is to understand it fully. Because things can be beautiful and implicated, comforting and costly, gentle and historical. That is maturity, to hold both truths at once, to love the warmth and still question the fire that made it possible. Today, the old empire is gone. The British Empire faded. Its colonies fought back. Its authority fractured. Its myths weakened. The map changed. The crown shrank. History moved on. But traces remain in borders, in languages, in trade routes, in inequality, and yes, in tea. Everyday objects are like fossils. They carry old worlds inside them, sometimes without us knowing, sometimes without us wanting to know. And maybe that is why this story matters now, because we still live inside systems built by ordinary desire. Not just tea, phones, coffee, clothes, chocolate, oil, lithium, convenience, pleasure, speed. We still hold small comforts in our hands without always asking what built them, who labored for them, who paid for them, who disappeared beneath them. And maybe that is the deepest lesson of tea. Not just what it did to Britain, but what it reveals about us. That humans are strange creatures. We can turn leaves into ritual, ritual into culture, culture into identity, identity into economy, economy into empire. And then forget where it began. A leaf. Just a leaf. That is how history hides, not only in monuments, but in habits, not only in speeches, but in sips. So the next time you lift a warm cup to your lips, pause, feel the heat, notice the steam before the first sip, and ask yourself, how many worlds are inside ordinary things? How much of human history lives quietly in our hands? Because civilization is not only built by what we fight for, it is also built by what we consume without thinking. And maybe wisdom begins there, in noticing, in remembering, in refusing to call something small just because it feels familiar. Tea did not conquer the world alone. People did. Desire did. Power did. But tea was there, softly, quietly, patiently. A leaf that traveled through empires, a comfort that crossed oceans, a ritual that outlived kings. And perhaps that is the most human truth of all. The things that soothe us can also shape us. The things we love can also rule us. And history, so often, does not arrive screaming. It arrives warm, in a cup.